Welcome aboard, folks. I'm Stephen Malkowich, your captain on this adventure called Ship of Fools. I'm a fool. Lucky for you, I'm not sailing solo. Join me and a boatload of people, all just trying to make sense of this crazy world. It's a fabulous mess, and you're invited. I'd like to welcome Dr. Sanjay Jeram, who's a political science professor specializing in nationalism, immigration, and political culture, amongst probably many things that I'm not mentioning, to Ship of Fools, where wit meets wisdom. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for coming. We find ourselves one of the. I guess what we'll start with here, Sanjay, is let's talk about a little bit about your past, and so that we can frame our discussion further.
Sure.
Okay, you start off with where you grew up and how you ended up at SFU.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to tell the
Reader's Digest.
Yeah, the short version.
Yeah.
I was born in Toronto and grew up there. I was actually an athlete growing up, not so much an intellectual. I played competitive tennis and I was on Team Canada for all my age categories, kind of growing up to the age of, about 16, 17, and thought that I was going, and I did end up going on a scholarship to the U.S. University in Chicago and sort of not really thinking about academics. And then I got there and realized that I wanted to take school seriously. And that kind of led me to do a 360. I sort of stopped playing tennis competitively at that point, went back to U of T, decided I wanted to go to law school, ended up in a political science and economics degree. And as you know, the short version is that I just was inspired by a certain professor kind of later in my undergraduate who kind of got me into the idea of academics and pursuing that path. And, I sort of followed his lead in terms of thematics. He was interested in identity and nationalism in Southeast Asia, but I ended up, just having this weird fascination with Spain and the Basque Country, which kind of led me on this this project that where I studied essentially how immigration was being received in this area of Spain that's not Spain. That's sort of like, I guess, the easy way for Canadian audience to say it's the Quebec of Spain, right? There's
almost
more
a separate country.
Exactly, right? It's a separate culture, a separate language, and they also, like Canada, Spain has its own version of federalism that's different, and so these regions have their own powers. And so I was kind of the first one on the ground, sort of studying from a Canadian perspective. Okay, we know what happened in Quebec and the immigration trajectory there, and the different ways that sort of unfolded. What can the Canadian literature say about what's going on in this region and how this government and this society is receiving immigration? And that was basically my dissertation, right? And it went over well because I was able to communicate it to a Canadian audience, which again, bringing a dissertation back to a Canadian audience and trying to get a job in Canada, that, worked to my advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of ended up at Brock University for my first non-tenure track job. And then I was kind of on the market, as many academics are, for a little while. And I kind of lucked out. It ended up at SFU. And so I guess in the time I've been at SFU, I really kind of made the shift of focusing more on Canadian politics, specifically with the same kind of thematic interest. So now I kind of focus on national identity, federalism, culture in Canada, and I sort of published sporadically with different co-authors on aspects of Canadian politics.
How long have you been at SFU?
I have been there since 2016.
2016, so 9 years, 10 years.
Yeah, just
10 years. It's 2000. Yeah, we're 2000.
July 1st, 2016 was my starting date. Yeah.
Okay, and so when you talk about you focus on Canadian politics and you focus on the effect of immigration, and those are hot topics, very, very hot topics, and one of the things that I was reading, because I consume a lot of news because I have access to a number of newspapers, but one of the big issues now with post-secondary educational institutions in British Columbia as well as across Canada is foreign students and the revenue that they present, and which is creating budgeting issues. The last article I read was that UBC and SFU were kind of sort of okay, but everything else below that level was really suffering because foreign students pay a higher tuition. Are you seeing any? Is there any? And this wasn't in this isn't a preamble or anything like that. This is just something that came into my head
Sure.
when you're sitting here and I'm looking and thinking about things. Have you seen any impact of that at the school?
Certainly. I mean, there's, especially now, I'm currently interim chair of the department, which means I have a heavy dose of administrative work, which means budgeting and sort of being in liaising with sort of the administration in the university, sort of paying attention to those aspects of the university's sort of financial health. And certainly it's impacted us. We have been fortunate. The big universities in British Columbia and most provinces, I would assume, are a bit fortunate because the provincial government, in terms of how those visas are distributed, have tended to getting a better, share of that. But more importantly, we've tended to have a higher percentage of domestic students make up our student body compared to some of those smaller places. And so you put those two things together, and yes, it's certainly affecting us. And you can see there's a revenue drop if you just sort of look at the numbers. But we are trying to positively spin that, right? How can we do more or be better educators, provide better services to the students we do have, and also not perhaps worrying a little less about the sort of heavy competition from those smaller colleges and sort of trying to attract those foreign students, because we can't at the moment. So I think my sense is that, again, we're new into this, but we're trying to figure out how, what is our role now, given that we're not teaching as many foreign students and we're sort of focusing on more domestic students.
Okay. One of the big issues that I wanted to talk about was the political situation here in British Columbia.
Yeah.
Because it's a bit of a gong show.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not a bit of a gong show. It is a gong show. I can't keep up. I don't know. I can't. And I'm a political person. I always wondered, I grew up on the prairies, Sanjay, and where I grew up, you could run a monkey in a blue suit, and you always got a conservative. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I was brought up, a business family. I never understood why, and during my tenure when I was going to university and I worked in Ottawa, I knew the Social Credit Party out here was affiliated with the Conservative Party, but I never understood why there was never ever a Conservative Party in BC. Now I know why. Because they can't play in the same sandbox. They just cannot. It's impossible for them to. And I believe it's unique. I don't know if it's something in the air out here or what it is, but of all the provinces in this country, they're incapable. And I don't want to say that, there's, because you always have conservative factions and you have liberal factions. Here in British Columbia, the Conservative Party has imploded. The BC Conservative Party has imploded. Thoughts?
So their implosion, obviously, from we have the highs of 2024 when they were essentially a moribund party, and Rustat seemingly revived the party, but I would say we could argue about that, but it had more to do with just Pierre Poilievre's meteoric rise at that moment and the ability of Rustat sort of to connect with Poilievre's sort of brand at a moment when there was sort of growing disenchantment with the sort of left-leaning politics across the country and coming out of the pandemic. So when you say implosion of the Conservative Party, I assume you're referring to this specific kind of sequence of events that happened in the past few months.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
What ends up with Rustat resigning, and
yes.
Currently they have an interim leader, but I believe it was just yesterday or today that they actually announced that they have a finally committee struck to sort of decide how they're going to choose the next leader, right? It's a party with obviously sort of developing institutional mechanisms. They don't have a clear procedure because this has never happened to the party in its sort of new era since it's actually become a force in the province recently. So maybe I'll just take your question in a slightly different direction here. I think that, as you mentioned, it's the Social Credit Party, and you mentioned sort of prairie politics and Western politics. And I think that what I see as someone who, is familiar, especially with, Ontario politics, federal politics, but also, pretty well across the country, given, my background and my expertise, is that this may seem strange, but what's going on, right? You have factions of what was a sort of a very challenging group to hold together, right? The Conservative Party under Restat was a sort of blend of kind of fiscal conservatives, sort of the business community, also social conservatives, right? This is pretty common across the country when you get into sort of conservative politics. And so what you have now with Centre BC under Karen Kirkpatrick, I believe her name is, and then One BC, which is the more sort of social conservative faction. It may seem like, wow, what's going on here? But it's really just at a moment of sort of where the factionalism within a conservative party overwhelmed it. And that is not unique or in some way, I think, any kind of like overly, what's the word I'm looking for? Unique to BC, right? This has happened in conservative politics across Canada over time. We think about the easy example at the federal level, right? We think about the 90s with the Reform Party. And we think about how they tried to rebrand under Canadian Alliance. And then you had this sort of fighting between the PCs and Conservatives. And you had the British Conservatives claiming or that when Peter MacKay became leader and he had to affirm that he would not, under any circumstances, align with Stephen Harper's alliance at that point. And he did it because he thought it was strategically a good move, right? And through the Harper years, Harper worked really hard to maintain that challenging coalition, and he made a lot of concessions. And many social conservatives felt abandoned by what he did to keep the coalition kind of strong, but they had nowhere else to go. And there were sort of moments when you felt like it might break, but it didn't, and it still proceeds to this day. And right now, you feel like, well, what happens if Poilievre resigns and the party chooses a more kind of soft-spoken academic type with a commitment to sort of fiscal policies, kind of like Carney, right? Imagine that Carney is the leader of Conservatives. Do those kind of the kind of populist right that Poilievre has brought into the mix with his language and his discourse? Do they bolt and do they create a new party, right? So this dynamic going on right now in British Columbia is just simply the challenge of politics in a parliamentary system with the first past the post system. You can't really win. It's really challenging to win, but if you don't have a big tent party.
Okay, so I can be corrected on this statement that I'm going to make, but how come the Liberals never seem to have this problem? Is that because they're typically fence walkers and they're
the federal Liberals?
Federal Liberals, yes. They're whichever way the wind blows. You say tent, their tent is massive. It's always, and it seems to be whichever way you need. That's me being who I am, looking at it from a political perspective. They can be whatever they want to at any given time to get elected. Am I?
So really, maybe
I can be corrected.
No, maybe this metaphor is going to fail, but I think in my head it works. So I'm going to try it. Okay. So if you think about a tent, and we're sticking with that metaphor, right? A party is like a tent. It needs to capture enough people to win an election. Without getting into the rules of the sort of intersection of parliamentary institutions and first past the post institutions, right? We can get in there, but I don't want to turn this into a Paul 100 lecture, right? So, but there's a certain size of tent that you need. It shapeshifts a little bit, but it's certain size. And I'd say the Liberals, they just like any party that wants to win government, they pick up the tent and they move it one direction or the other. Their tent may be slightly bigger most of the time than the other parties. Then especially when we think about whatever conservative party is the dominant party at the time, where progressive conservatives in the past, and now the Conservative Party of Canada. Maybe their tent is a little smaller, and maybe they try to make it bigger and it stretches too much and it breaks. Whereas the Liberal Party, because they sort of sit in the center of the ideological spectrum, they have the easier time maybe kind of making some extra space, putting some extra stools in there. But they do just like conservatives. They pick up the tent and they move left or right, right? And right now they've moved right because more people in Canada are have a feeling that the left failed them, right? And we can, I'm sure we could find many people who would just blame Justin Trudeau squarely. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? But that's where we are right now. And
let's talk about that.
Sure.
I'd like to hone in on that, like blaming Justin Trudeau. You say it's a lot more nuanced than that. Expand on that comment and I'm not going to put words into your mouth about that, but expand, because we actually, when my wife and I were driving over here, we were having this very conversation, and I was airing my grievances. But I would be very interested in saying, okay, it wasn't just, you said it's not just Justin Trudeau. It was, what was it?
Right. So starting what I think was not his fault, right?
Okay.
So, and then we can talk more about what we might be directly attributed to his brand and himself, right? Is that I think that the frustration, and usually I'm one who believes, and I think there's good research to back this up, that usually you can't really disentangle one's economic and social frustrations, right? Usually there's some link between their economic frustrations and what they feel concerned about at a societal or value level, right? And so if you think about 2015, when the economy was stronger and Justin Trudeau sailed to his majority, and then you have there was a sort of bubbling problem of affordability that forces were already at play that had nothing to do with him in terms of housing affordability being the major one, and then you have the pandemic sort of hit. And, we can go back and sort of rerun history, but I'm not sure that a conservative government does anything that much differently in terms of the fiscal response to the pandemic. I just don't see it based on how Harper dealt with the 2008 crisis. He more or less did the same thing.
Yes.
We could debate nuances there, but it wasn't
your way out of it.
It wasn't. Yeah. Yes, spending your way out of it through very specific kinds of programs. And again, could there have been differences, different things done? Sure. But I think that there wasn't really I don't think there was an ideological response to the pandemic. I would say that was a response that either major party in Canada probably would have taken more or less, even though obviously the Conservatives were going to, in opposition, had the opportunity to criticize because they didn't have to they didn't have the reins at that point, right? Mm-hmm. So it's easy just to yell at clouds. So I think that, and then coming out of the pandemic, these forces that sort of, the global economy, Trump, these kinds of things that have accentuated affordability.
Trump.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Right. Have accentuated affordability problems and made people insecure about their economic future. Well, it's easy now to look at Justin and say, well, if I'm looking at this through an ideological lens, what I see was a prime minister that I grew to dislike, or I never liked him. He had a left-wing slant, and therefore somehow his spending, his ideological mindset about how the economy should run, and that there's no issues with debt and there's no issues with spending, somehow is a direct cause of my financial issues right now. And I think that's just generally how people who are not really spending all their time following politics would draw that connection. But I think, so going to the second part is that now Justin Trudeau, beyond his management of the economy, had a particular brand when it comes to social issues and values, right? This was a very sort of kind of further than we've seen in Canada at the federal level, kind of adherence to sort of, for lack of a better term, progressiveness to some people, even who might consider themselves progressive, to a fault, right? Mm-hmm. This emphasis on sort of the way he spoke, from his socks to his sort of emphasis on most Canadians do support, this is a word that I always hate using, but multiculturalism, but the way that he spoke about it, his emphasis on it, the way he sort of played up, gender equity in the cabinet, without, as a sort of, like to credit himself for something grand, again,
calls himself a feminist.
Correct. There you go. You got it, right? So, I mean, these kinds of things, over time tended to tie together with those who were frustrated with their economic situation, who didn't necessarily have a deep-seated connection to these kinds of values, could then feel like these are also things that they are rejecting about him and about Canada under him that go together. And now you have this sort of fusion of the economic and social that creates this sort of like villain-like status of him in the rearview mirror. So that's, again, my simplistic
Mm-hmm.
take of why, why we've shifted again, and why the party is, going back to your original point, is that why the Liberal Party has picked up the tent and moved to the right pretty, decidedly, not only, policy wise, but also sort of like in terms of their values, and even just the public facing sort of discourse of the party under Mark Carney, right? He speaks a very different language than Justin Trudeau, and tries to avoid those kinds of symbolic moments. He's not going to be tweeting, for example, again, it was nothing. There's nothing wrong with what, in sort of principle, about like tweeting about, welcome to Canada, but I don't think, in the context of the refugees that came from Syria, again, that it's maybe a good policy move, but it's more of the symbolic way in which Justin Trudeau presented it, I think, is a stark contrast to how Mark Carney might do the exact same thing and would not play it up in the same way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those things make a difference in politics, whether we like it or not.
That is a pretty dramatic shift, though, for the Liberal Party. That was a turn, like a real substantial turn. Like this last federal election was just, Poilievre was already, getting his new key cut, like he was, and then he ends up losing his seat. He loses his seat as he's the leader. That was that. In my history, I was trying to go back and say, okay, I've participated. I've seen a lot of elections. I've never seen anything like that. That it turned. It just all of a sudden turned, and the party changed. It turned on a dime when he came in, because, and the thing is that if you read his bio, it's nothing like, he's a big money guy. He's a Davos guy. He got elected. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that he has conservatives walking across the floor too, which is totally, that's mind-boggling too. Right. For a dummy like me sitting there watching that, and I'm going, oh wow, Jesus, they need the conservatives need a new leader. But I and maybe I'm just too old school too. When the leader loses their riding that they've held for 22 years, I would just think that the right thing to do is to step down. That's my own personal opinion, being the hack that I am. But there was none of that, and I don't see it getting any better, because he's got members that are crossing the floor, and there's probably going to be more. But I digress here. We started talking about BC politics here and being in flux, and you're saying that that's historically that's not uncommon, that when you're going to have factions within the party. But I always look at things and say, okay, well, do you want to win? Do you want to win? Okay, because if you want to win, and this is the one thing I learned from Pierre Elliott Trudeau. When we walk out of caucus, when we have our meeting and we walk out, we can fight, like we can have a fist fight. But when we walk out, we're all arm in arm, and we stay the course, and that's how we're going to get elected. Okay, well, I can't have rogue, and I know when, in the Preston Manning years and things that were going on with reform, and I do remember that, and I do remember it all. Harper was able to coalesce to get everybody to come together. He did it. He upset some people, but at the same time, he made believers of those. Of the individuals within the party. And I always say this because of I talk personally about my conservatism in the prairies, is that we always had, at our constituent meetings, we always had people that weren't allowed to get to the microphone. We take their money and we take their support, but we never let Johnny speak. Because Johnny can support us, but we don't let him. We're certainly not going to let him get up on the podium and speak. And now I do believe in today's world, everyone has a voice. Everyone does, and I think that change, that's a dynamic too. That's changed substantially in the political sphere of things, I believe. You know,
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I mean, I think structurally, social media has allowed people to speak and more voices to be heard in a way that wasn't possible before, right? So even if a political party wants to mute certain voices and sort of keep them, outside of the public discourse and just hope that they pay their membership fees and vote for them,
it ain't gonna happen.
it's not. Yeah, exactly. Right. There's too many access points in today's world that allow these voices to be heard. And does that then lead directly to the fact that other people, connect with those? I would say probably is that, it's if you, no one, frustrations are, omnipresent, right? Is that how many people are actually like, wow, you know what? Everything in my life is great. And I think that the leaders are doing everything they can to create this great
And
life
my
for me.
tax dollars are being
exactly
spent
right. So
effectively.
there's always going to be frustrations, whether it steers you to the right or left or center or up, down, left. And I think that when you have all of this choice and all of these, different people there's no vetting anymore, right? There's no vetting of perspectives and viewpoints. And so that allows it to just kind of creates this sort of chaos that I think is just something we have to learn to live with and harness.
So let's talk a little bit like myself personally, I because I've traveled extensively in the United States for work, because we do own a number of newspapers throughout the U.S. And one of the proud things that what made us different is that we were a cultural mosaic here in Canada, and you guys are a cultural melting pot, and we're better. And as a matter of fact, I used to go to American Hockey League games in Providence, Rhode Island, with professors from Brown and just and we'd have these discussions. We'd have healthcare discussions. We'd have policy discussions. Now, knowing that New England is that's where the Pilgrims came, and very Democrat orientated area, very high in academia, knowledgeable, but I was always I could say that disseminated, or that made us different from the United States. I don't know if I can say that now.
So essentially, the age-old argument is multiculturalism versus mosaic. Was it ever true? Is it true now? I mean, my perspective is that it never was really that true. So what I mean by that is, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, you've already mentioned him, and this is a good moment to reintroduce him. I think that the introduction of multiculturalism, and one of the few political concepts that really is sort of it's Canadian, that it was sort of born in Canada, right? The people, German multiculturalism and French multiculturalism and didn't exist until it existed here, right? At least as a sort of as a symbolic concept. And the policies that stem from that, that's another story. We'll get there in a second. But I think he developed that really not so much as sort of a response to a genuine concern about cultural politics, but really as this is a pretty typical sort of Canadian politics interpretation, that it was a way to sort of try to manage Quebec separatism, right? Is that, so you did have, voices from what they called at that point, the third, I won't even try to use the term. It's just basically from the communities that were emerging in Canada, Italians, Greeks, like in that sort of wave of immigration. And so Trudeau, was under threat, and was a very strongly against the idea of recognizing Quebec as a nation and sort of ceding to the kind of binational view of Canada. Multiculturalism was a way to say, you know what, okay, we are diverse in Quebec, and French speakers, you are diverse and recognized in Canada, but so are Polish Canadians, and so are Greek Canadians, whatever, right? So, and it was his way of trying to get, and in some ways I would know, again, I'm probably reading into his motives even stronger than perhaps historians have, but I think he consciously thought that, okay, if I get, everyone else on my side, I can beat these guys, because he had a thing against Quebec separatists and Quebec nationalists that was personal,
Yes.
right? So I do think that that's a, not an unreasonable interpretation. So, and then, of course, to some extent, he's quite successful at making multiculturalism an important concept in Canada, one that sort of gets lauded, tossed around, part of our national identity. Usually, I think when most kinds of, there's some academic research that will show that to be true, that when people asked, what is Canadian, multiculturalism or diversity or some version of that will often be high on the list. But I would say that there, again, it's so hard to synthesize a whole body of research in a couple sentences, but there is a long trend, or sorry, a long history of research that's survey based mostly, so the large quantitative surveys, that shows that when you ask Canadians over time questions about multiculturalism that breaks it down a little further, they're not as multicultural as we think, in the sense of do you support, do you think people should adhere to Canadian values and norms as opposed to their own culture? Questions like that, once you break down multiculturalism into some more constituent parts, Canada isn't that special, and it hasn't really been that special. No, it's
You're
not
breaking my heart.
Right. I mean, yeah, you've probably heard this before, right? We're not that. Yeah, exactly. Right. We're not that special. We've never been that special. Sure. I'm not knocking our. I think the fact that we've managed our country and stayed together and maintained peace with such high levels of immigration, for the most part, is great, and it's sort of a testament to our people. But in terms of people's real sort of fundamental core belief in the idea of multiculturalism, that everyone should have, culture should be individual, right? And cultural communities should be able to have their own, but also participate in the center in any way they want in the mainstream, but proceed to their sort of cultural communities and have those and thrive them. The truth of the matter is, I don't think that's has ever really been as strong. And the evidence should
but in Winnipeg, we used to have Folklorama.
Right. Yeah.
We used to have Folklorama in Winnipeg.
Right.
That was the epitome
right.
of multiculturalism. We were a cultural mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
We got to go from pavilion to pavilion and eat Swedish food, Ukrainian food, German food,
Yeah.
And you're telling me that was just a fallacy now.
So just to bring this back to I like where we're going with this, but I mean, if you did mention, so German, Ukrainian, Poles, right? So you're talking about the sort of pre-60s, 70s wave of immigration, right? Yeah. And so things definitely change as Asia and Africa become the main sources of immigration. Right. And there's a clear, you can see it in some of the historical artifacts, when there's sort of pushes against, what is a good Canadian? And we could look back even at the changes in the legislation where there was coded racism in the sort of discretion give to the bureaucracy to select immigrants, until the point system then kind of wiped away that discretion. But that discretion was coded racism if you go back and look at it. Mm-hmm. So, again, even this is sort of post multiculturalism as a concept in Canada, and it's still, and obviously the legacy of that, racist immigration system did not just disappear with the point system either, right? Mm-hmm. But when you get into sort of public opinion, I think that, when numbers were small and there was, even if people could express a commitment to multiculturalism, when it wasn't really something that they had to sort of face as a sort of reality, right? This, there was still a kind of more or less an English-speaking, European-centric sort of cultural core when, immigration was not, when the numbers were not, as high as they became. You can't really compare that situation in people's public opinion about it to later, right? So if you think there could be a very simple explanation as to why I'm making the argument as to that, we've never been that special, is that once immigration from more diverse sources or just put it bluntly, racially different sources became higher, things started to shift. And I think that people's tolerance for multiculturalism started to fray a little bit. Not that most people weren't generally supportive, but it wasn't this sort of everybody holds hands here and we are different in the United States. When I would say that the data from the United States shows kind of the same thing, is that, most people who, live amongst immigrants, and especially in the major cities, would probably have similar views to Canadians, right? Or similar diversity of views. There's going to be some people who are strongly believe that there needs to be a sort of a national core, a national culture, and those who don't, right? And I think that's, the kind of, for most liberal democratic countries, that's kind of the same thing.
Do we like that segues into the next, like, do we have a national culture? Do we?
Yeah.
Do-
This reminds me of discussions. So in graduate school, one of my close friends is he's Quebecois, and we'd always talk about this, and he would always be like, "Well, what? I'm not going to even pretend to do his accent, but his accent was great. He had that perfect
French.
but it was because he spoke English really well, but he had a bit of an accent, and it was just always jealous because he can go to the bars, everybody wants to talk to him, right? Anyways. So, he always mentioned like, well, is Terry Fox important to you? I'm like, I don't. I'm sure he did great things. I'm sure. I don't know much about him or things like that. Or, why do you go to Tim Hortons? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I didn't think about it. I just go like in the Tim Hortons Starbucks. I think I might have gone to Tim Hortons once. He's like, is that because you're a Canadian nationalist? I'm like, I didn't think about it that deeply. Right. So there is a lot of interesting. So if you think about someone like him who grew up in sort of the east of Montreal in a sort of more nationalist culture, to him, there is another of sort of English Canadian culture. And to him, he observed it in this way that I think you or I growing up in English Canada just never probably processed it that way. Right. And so to ask, is there a we to Canadian identity? There's lots of good, interesting research on this, but the answer I would say is not really. And the truth of the matter is, just like in the same kind of questions could be asked, let's say in Germany or in the United Kingdom, where people will often say that they feel strongly about the national identity, but then when you try to break it down into constituent parts and try to, even using quantitative methods to try to say, like, what are the constituent parts, and get people to, give the answers and then sort of compile that data, what you get is that a mishmash of kind of things like hockey and like Tim Hortons and things like that. But what it comes down to when you put it in real terms, it's really just a commitment to liberal democratic institutions. And people will often sort of fall on that, the idea that, that recognizing the Constitution, recognizing that people have their individual rights. And is that cultural? Is that anything that's really liberal democracy? That's not, a Canadian nation that's sort of different from, say, the German nation in terms of its fundamental cores, right?
So we don't have a culture.
You could put it that way. Yeah. I mean, we have one. I would say it's thin, and like it's going, and it's so fragmented and varied across the country that it sort of amounts to a very, but that's, to me, I'm an optimist, and that's the beauty in it, right? Is that the fact that it holds us together, even though we don't even understand why. Like, for example, why are people paying attention to, or why do we care so much about Olympic hockey? It's one of the fascinating things, like by myself. Yeah. I love hockey, and I go to watch it.
We could debate who the players that were picked.
For sure, we could do that. But I
think it's political.
It sometimes is, right? Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But when you look at that jersey and you look at the feelings that are evoked through the selection, the lead up, hearing the players talk about putting on that jersey, it's almost like they're fed a script. Do I believe that each and every one of them, feels that exact way, or do they feel like compelled to say that because they've put on the jersey, right? It's this sort of like interesting kind of component of our national culture that we've kind of developed over time. But, would that hold up in terms of holding us together in a time of crisis? And that's really what nationalism is.
That's exactly what nationalism is.
And I don't think so, right? And that's the thing, is that that's what I think, why I would agree with you, not as strongly that we don't have a culture, but I don't think we have as strong a national identity as we tend to want to think, right? Is that it would, in the context of crisis, I do think, it has the potential of fraying. And that could be true of most liberal democracies, because, liberal institutions tend to sort of foster more individualism, and it's challenging to maintain collectivism and unity in the face of that. And is that I'm not making a normative judgment about that. Yeah. That's just the way it is, right?
And the thing is, on the world stage, it's certainly showing itself.
Yeah,
it is. As we speak, we've had the war in Ukraine. What are we in the fourth year?
Something like 2022. Yes.
Yeah. 4 years. Mm-hmm. 4 years. Okay. I'm Ukrainian. I have a problem with this. But at the same time, I'm going, what's a solution? What? And the thing, well, NATO's certainly not doing nothing. Okay. There's no collective resolve to solve that situation. Okay, whether or not we could debate whether or not it is solvable, or you know, and there, but I look at that and I can't believe that it's gone on as long as it has. And I didn't even believe you can ask my wife when all that was happening. I was going, there's no way he's going to do it. There'll be a civil war in Ukraine, but there will never be an invasion. Like, they're never going to actually invade. And I was wrong. And that's, now I look at and I go, okay, well, I look at our American neighbors, and I listen to Donald Trump's rhetoric, and when he makes jabs and says, I'm going to make you the 51st state, but at least he's not calling Carney governor. He's called, but how difficult would it be for the United States to take Canada? Be very easy, very easy, very easy. And that's why I ask, okay, do we have a culture? Do we have our what is our identity? Like, what identity do we have? And this sort, and I want to get to this too, because you do a lot of research and study on immigration too, correct?
I have in the past.
You have in the
moving away from it now, but yes, sure, yeah.
So
I have.
So immigration has an effect on culture,
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Huge effect. Yeah,
huge effect.
Yeah.
And I moved out here to the Lower Mainland of BC in 1994, and went back and forth a couple of times back to Winnipeg. But one of the reasons I wanted to come out here was to expose my children to the multicultural nature of the West Coast of British Columbia, because it was like something that I had never seen before.
Right.
And I'm glad I did it.
Mm-hmm.
I have no regrets, because but that very thing that enticed me to come, at times it appears it sometimes is overwhelming.
For sure.
And by overwhelming, I mean, firecrackers and fireworks on New Year's and Christmas and Halloween and everything, and scaring the shit out of my dogs. Never had that. Where I grew up, we didn't have fireworks at Halloween. We didn't I just learned all that stuff coming out here.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, this past New Year's, there was, and it scares the crap out of my dogs at 3:00 in the morning when they're lighting off fireworks. So that's a cultural thing, we never did that, but maybe I'm in the, but that's anecdotal to the bigger question of how immigration has affected the Canadian culture,
mm-hmm.
our culture, our and like, I suppose, nationalism, but your opinion or your research, or what does it, when people come here, when people immigrate to this country, I'll speak, we had on as a guest, we had Alex Allegra, who is he's a Canadian mariachi
mm-hmm.
guy.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I'll say world renowned as a Canadian mariachi guy from Mexico. And he, to me, he epitomized the Canadian. He celebrated his culture, his Mexican heritage, but he was Canadian.
Right.
And maybe I'm just a dummy. And I thought that's what being a cultural mosaic meant. And does that, am I in a dream? Is that a dream world that I'm living in? Or
I think that's generally, because that's the thing, right? In the positive framing of multiculturalism and what it does for us, that of course, when we have examples, like we see it on TV, we see it in our movies, in our cultural content, this sort of, it's no accident, right? That we have, for example, if you have a federal government ad, right? So look, there'll always be sort of intentional demonstrations of diversity. You have, usually you can create, positive feelings about multiculturalism when, you show someone who is, cooking some kind of, food from their sort of home culture, things like that. But, just kind of coming back to your comment about firecrackers, but we could sort of broaden that out to it's a thing, is that when Canadians are caught between a rock and a hard place, this is my answer to your question as best I can, is to say that what, the data, but also anecdote shows, and what I think my interpretation of it is that we are both, there are times when we feel that the limits of multiculturalism or our sort of acceptance of diversity get tested. For example, if we get frustrated that we can't read signs, in a certain part of the city because they're in foreign languages, do we feel there's, people, it shows in surveys that people tend to think that there should not be shop signs with foreign languages predominating, right? And similar kind of parallel to the debate in Quebec about French and English, that happens here, but we don't have the same framework to deal with the same sort of kind of concepts to deal with it. People tend to, wonder. Of course, I've heard parents myself. I'm a parent of a young child, and I've heard people talk about where they want to send their kids to school, and they don't want, they want diversity, but not too much where they send their kids, and things like that, where I'm just, the casual observer listening and thinking about it. I have my own opinions, but that's not important. As a social scientist, I'm just listening and thinking, okay, this is, we have both a sort of love-hate relationship with it. But I think that what's different, trying to tie this into our American conversation, we have trouble kind of expressing perhaps how much frustration we have with it. It comes out in certain ways, and it's coming out now as the sort of consensus of immigration is breaking, and there's less, and there's other reasons for that too, economic ones, but cultural as well. But Americans tend to be, are a little more comfortable, those who just sort of are comfortable expressing American identity and what it should be. Whereas even those here who feel that, like there should be an emphasis on English as the primary language, there should be an emphasis on our historical symbols of Canadian history, our flag prominently placed in places, sort of emphasis on for some, even our British connection still, and what have you. We're not as comfortable expressing that because that almost way makes us then not American, right? So we're caught in this sort of really difficult between a rock and a hard place where I don't think most Canadians are not as robustly supportive of multiculturalism in a sort of broad sense as we tend to sort of portray in our sort of official discourse. But we also are not as willing to kind of stamp out what it means or what people desire to be a Canadian sort of national culture, because we're then worried about does that make us then American, right? So we're kind of just we don't know what to do with it, right? So if we think about, the temporary kind of response to Trump's tariffs, where Canadians rallied around buying Canadian products, and I wonder again, as that sort of fizzled from the news cycle, again, I'm not saying it disappeared, and it was an interesting display of Canadian nationalism, but going kind of back, I think I'm sort of anticipating what your listeners might think to what I said about, well, how come, Canadians rallied around the flag during, that phase when the Trump tariffs were instituted? And I would say my opinion on that is that, well, was that a crisis? It was a crisis, and it continues to be a crisis. But was that sort of temporary kind of like, commitment to buying Canadian goods, is that really resemble, or does that mean that we have some kind of deep shared connection and cultural connection that's going to endure through other periods crises that are maybe coming, right? If we do get invaded by some miraculous turn of events, or if there's a World War III or things like that, I don't know. I don't think that's really like you can really draw a tight connection there, right? It's one thing to have these sort of temporary bursts of national identity, but I think in Canada we are stuck in this sort of situation where we want something, we don't know how to make it because making it, perhaps we don't know how to make it not American, and so we're kind of left in this sort of kind of lacuna, I would say, right? So yeah.
Looking ahead, and if you had a crystal ball, which I know you don't, but if you had a crystal ball, where are we going? Like, we touched the BC political thing that'll work itself out. It'll play itself out, however it does.
I think it's pretty fascinating. I mean, what actually is going to happen, whether the Conservative Party exists at the next election, and there's also, I know we didn't go there, but I mean, I would want to mention something, and because I thought of this when I was reading your notes, being especially being from, I think, what they call here Eastern Canada. I don't consider Toronto Eastern Canada, but I think, I've been here long enough now that I've come to accept that it's called Eastern Canada here. Is that, when I look at what could happen, and out in British Columbia, we don't have the same tradition of sort of Toryism or progressive conservatism that you have in the east of Canada. But it looks like, if we take, for example, it's at this point, it's a party with no MLAs, but I was reading just out of interest, Centre BC's sort of set of values. And it sounds like they're just basically lifting it off the old sort of progressive conservative script, right? And I wonder if because it's sort of novel to British Columbia, and I wonder if it'll seem as something interesting and new. An idea that we have certain values that we want to uphold with the state, but to also recognize that there are limits to people's individual freedom. Like this kind of, slightly paternalistic Toryism with the sort of hint of fiscal conservatism, which is really kind of has a strong tradition in especially in the Atlantic provinces.
Yeah. Yes.
It just wasn't part of BC's history. It strikes me as interesting that, and I almost wonder if Centre BC is, someone from there's listening, maybe they can, write me an email and tell me, right? Are they banking on that they can create a version of that here, right? Because the BC Liberals weren't really that. That's another story.
That's correct.
And so that hasn't really been a force here. And so you call it Centre BC, you call it you can't call it Progressive Conservative because you can't use the same title as the party that's already registered. So yeah, I think what actually spins out there is going to be really interesting. But we can leave it there. Yeah.
So, back to the crystal ball. That where do you see, and from a political perspective, looking ahead, and where do you see, and let's talk federally. Federal politics here, and then a little bit of global, but federal. Where do you see the next 2-3 years, politically speaking, in Canada, and our relationship? And I'll say, I'm not just going to say with the United States, but with the rest of the world, because we have cut down. We've cut our immigration quotas have been cut down substantially. They're coming down. They are. Mm-hmm. I read that a couple of days ago. Actually, looked at the numbers, and they're going. It's tougher and tougher, and obviously they're cracking down on international students as well. There's a lot of things that are happening that are discouraging immigration. Okay. Where does that leave Canada as a nation politically?
Well, for a country that obviously relies on immigration for population replacement, it's sort of asking bigger questions that we haven't really reflected on in a long time, right? So we're just focusing on this specific idea of numbers. We just keep it, tight and narrow here, right? So I think for a long time, the consensus was that we needed to continue to keep immigration high because it would help our economy to grow our economy, to ensure that we had a significant tax base to support our sort of state, and then we feel as though our state service, our welfare state is important to us, especially when we think about ourselves in contrast to the United States, all that stuff, right? So that sort of fed into a consensus. Now that seems to be amazingly broken. That is quite a feat that has that. A number of forces, again, that we talked about earlier. I would say, Justin Trudeau plus a number of other things led to this kind of situation. Now we have to think about, well, what is our new sort of consensus about how to manage our economy, right? If it's not immigration is going to grow the economy, what is it, right? Is it going to be, is it going to be natural resources again, right? Is it going to be something else? Because Carney is kind of speaking at this point, what we has is sort of visions that are not, they're compatible, but we don't know. There's
no pipeline's going to be built. Let's get real here.
I am not the person to answer that question.
I'm going to say, sure. I'll say it. No pipeline's going to get built. Okay, so how are we going to?
Well, he has a minister dedicated to AI, and I don't know exactly. Right,
CBC reporter
Evan Solomon, right? Yeah. So that in and of itself is interesting. If you think about what does he have in mind there? How does that, how might that be a way that he wants to reshape Canada as in sort of innovative, country, perhaps a country that has traditionally relied on natural resources to grow their economy. Whatever Carney's master plan is on that front, it's yet to be revealed, right? So, TBD, I would say. But I think that we're going to have more conversations about what does growth look like if it's not going to be consistently high levels of immigration, right? What is that? How are we going to manage that? Because it is true, right? Immigration will grow the GDP, and it doesn't. What we have learned, it doesn't necessarily distribute income in the way that we may want it to, and so perhaps that's part of the reason why we're in the situation of having to drop the numbers. But I don't think that we've really had a robust conversation about what that means for the country long term if we're going to continue to pare that number down and to stay at sort of a lower level, right? Mm-hmm. So,
well, I think would it be fair to say though that the immigration, that the flow of immigrants coming into this country, though, I do, and this is anecdotal, purely anecdotal. Maybe it's not anecdotal because I'm having a thought here that did they change the point system?
I'm up to plead ignorance on that. Okay. I don't know, but I don't think it's changed dramatically.
Okay,
right? There may have been some tinkering with it in terms of, I think there's a little more emphasis on language and a little bit less on just simply having more education. But education is a little bit more nuanced, I think now. But I'm not totally sure about
because
that.
I was the next comment I was going to make was about the immigration and being more selective as to the immigrants that you're bringing in. Mm-hmm. To fill, and one is right at is like in the medical profession. Mm-hmm. There are doctors and that come from South Asia and are unable to practice, are able to pass all the appropriate exams, yet are still unable to practice, and that's an issue. But like this goes back to my anecdotal thought that we could be more selective with the immigrants that we have coming in here, and we could still grow, because 100% that our country here relies on the inflow of immigrants coming into this country to grow the economy. That's the only thing that's going to. And because we are, stereotypically we're hewers of wood, drawers of water, we can't seem to add value to nothing. But I'm being facetious somewhat.
No, but you're not. I mean, I think Canada ranks quite low on sort of a broad measures of innovation compared to other sort of advanced economies. So you're being blunt about it, but it's true. We do suffer from a lack of capacity to add sort of high value to sort of finished products. That's something that we do lack. We aren't great.
We have, we have a lot of resources, but we don't add value to those resources. We push them on or apply them on to somewhere else where they add that value. But I do think so anyway. But looking ahead, you got away from the. I want some predictions. I want some.
Sure.
Where do you see us going here?
Predictions about federal politics.
Federal politics.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a boring prediction, but I think that the Carney Liberals will govern their full term. So we're not going to be seeing an election in Canada for quite a while. I do think that whether or not they get another four-crosser to make a sort of formal majority or not, I don't think it's going to change anything, because I think the reality is that my prediction, if I was to, again, I hate predictions like this, but I will say that I don't foresee Pierre Poilievre contesting the next federal election for the Conservative Party. Now, I've been wrong about things before, but I've been right. I remember a student of mine who can back me up on this is that, when Poilievre was flying high in the polls, right at the height, and someone asked me, do you think it's inevitable he's going to win? I'm like, I don't think so. And, I had reasons for it, but also it was somewhat speculative, but I was right on that. So, but I do not think that he will contest the election, because I think the timeline is going to be too long for him to sort of weather the storm that he is facing. I think that, by the time we have another federal election, I think there will be a new leader. Who that leader will be, I have no idea.
Okay. Well, on that note, if anybody wanted to, like, have you written a book?
I've published articles. I've not written a full book.
Okay. When are you going to write a book?
I'm going to write a book. My kid's a bit older, and I'll write a book. Yeah.
Okay. If anybody wanted to check you out, though, you Google.
You can Google me. You could find all my my articles and stuff on my website. Yeah, or on the SCP website. Yeah.
Well, listen, Sanjay, thank you so much for coming here and talking politics. We could, like, I try and, as I said, I try and keep it to a time frame because I could keep on talking.
Sure.
There's things that pop into my head a lot.
Yeah.
But I thank you so much for coming today, and we will have you back again.
I had a great time. I'm happy to come back.
Thank you so much, Sanjay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Take care. You may be asking yourself, what's any of this got to do with me? Absolutely nothing. Until next time.